The coup attempt was meant to bring him down. General Langley's accusations were designed to isolate and discredit him, but instead of toppling President Ibrahim Traoré, these efforts only strengthened him. What was intended to destabilize Burkina Faso has had the opposite effect, solidifying Traoré's position and thrusting his nation into the international spotlight rather than losing support. Traoré has gained it both from his people and from unexpected places around the world. What's even more interesting is that it's not just ordinary citizens across Africa and the diaspora who are rallying behind him. In the wake of the failed coup, entire nations have come forward affirming their support and commitment to both Burkina Faso and President Traoré. Among them is Cuba, a long-time ally whose relationship with Burkina Faso has been rooted in shared struggles and revolutionary solidarity. Cuba's support comes as no surprise, but Denmark's response does. Just last year, Denmark shut down its embassy in Ouagadougou. Today, that same nation is reopening the door, signaling a shift in perception and policy. The message is clear, the world is taking notice. This renewed international engagement raises important questions. Why are nations, some of whom had distanced themselves, now returning to the table? What does this say about Traoré's growing influence and Burkina's new place in the global order? In today's story, we examine the evolving diplomatic landscape and explore how the failed coup may have done more to reshape Burkina Faso's foreign relations than any summit or speech ever could have. From Havana to Copenhagen, one thing is certain: Burkina Faso is no longer on the sidelines. It's stepping into history. In August 2024, Denmark made a quiet but significant move. It announced the closure of its embassies in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. On the surface, the explanation seemed diplomatic. Denmark's foreign ministry released a carefully worded statement. Denmark will close its embassies in Burkina Faso and Mali and open new missions in Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda as part of a new African strategy as a result of military coups that have severely limited the scope for action in the Sahel region. The embassies in Burkina Faso and Mali will be closed. It sounded procedural, pragmatic, sensible, but the truth, as always, runs deeper. Most assume the closures were a direct response to the coups that shook these nations, Mali in 2020, Burkina Faso in 2022. And while the military takeovers may have sparked concern, they were not the real question for Denmark's withdrawal. There was no direct conflict, no diplomatic breakdown, no hostility between Denmark and Burkina Faso. What changed was the geopolitical alignment. Burkina Faso and Mali had shifted course, abandoning old loyalties to the West and forging new partnerships with Russia, China, and other Eastern powers in the eyes of Western capitals. This wasn't just a policy change, it was betrayal, a defiant rejection of Western influence. And Denmark, like many of its allies, made a choice. It wasn't about embassies or logistics. It was about signaling loyalty to the Western Bloc. Closing the embassies became a quiet act of protest, symbolic gesture of disapproval, not toward the people of Burkina Faso but toward the sovereign decision of its leaders to choose their own path. So while the official line cited limited operational scope, the reality was something far more political. The West was losing its grip on Sahel, and countries like Denmark were repositioning themselves accordingly. This wasn't diplomatic. This was pressure dressed as protocol. Perhaps Denmark thought its decision would send a message that by shutting down its embassy in Burkina Faso, it could apply subtle pressure. Perhaps Copenhagen believed that. President Traoré, faced with diplomatic isolation, will reconsider his alignment with Russia and the East and come crawling back to the West, but none of that happened. President Traoré didn't blink, neither did the military leaders of Mali or Niger. Instead, they stayed the course, resolute in their mission to break free from decades of Western influence. The West had played its card and it failed to shake them, and here's where the story takes a twist. Denmark never followed through since the announcement. In August 2024, no meaningful steps have been taken to actually close the Danish embassy in Ouagadougou. It's still there, still operating, still engaged. So why the bluff? Because the truth is uncomfortable. Europe needs Africa far more than it's willing to admit for years. Western politicians have painted Africa as a burden, a continent dependent on aid, unable to stand on its own. But if that were truly the case, why the panic over Russia and China's growing influence, while the urgency to re-establish diplomatic footprints after cutting them in Africa? If Africa were simply a recipient, an empty vessel waiting to be filled, then Western nations wouldn't care who filled it. But they do care, because beneath the narrative lies a reality they won't say out loud. Africa holds the resources, the markets, the demographic future, and Europe knows it. Denmark's hesitation to leave is not about diplomacy, it's about dependence. Behind the official language and closed-door meetings, one truth remains clear. Africa is no longer begging, and the West is no longer as confident as it once was. Sometimes the truth reveals itself not through protest but through policy. In a striking moment of honesty, Denmark's foreign minister admitted what many in the West hesitate to say out loud. Africa's geopolitical relevance and importance in international politics has never been greater. In 2050, 1 in every 4 people in the world will live in Africa. He wasn't just stating a fact, he was signaling a shift. A shift in power, in population, in potential. He acknowledged what the West has quietly feared, that Africa is rising and Europe can no longer afford to treat the continent as a subordinate. The embassy closures in Burkina Faso and Mali, they were never about safety or logistics. They were a political response to a continent pivoting eastward, to Russia, to China, to sovereignty. But since that announcement, Denmark has yet to shut down a single embassy. Why? Because behind the scenes, the West is scrambling not to lose its grip, and the urgency is growing, one of this century's most important foreign policy. Questions the minister added is whether Africa will orient itself more towards the East or the West. It's a geopolitical tug of war, and Europe now wants to prove it can offer something better. More investments, more trade, more scholarships. But African nations are no longer waiting for Western approval. They are choosing their allies, they are defining their future leaders, like President Ibrahim Traoré have made it clear. Africa will no longer be a pawn in someone else's game. The continent isn't begging for partnership, it's demanding respect. And the question now isn't whether Europe can win Africa back, it's whether Africa still wants what Europe has to offer. So now it all begins to make sense. Denmark never truly intended to sever ties with Burkina Faso, and today its actions speak louder than its earlier announcement. Despite declaring in 2024 that it will shut down its embassy in Ouagadougou, Denmark has done the exact opposite. Not only does the embassy remain open, but since the failed coup attempt, Denmark has moved swiftly to reaffirm its commitment to the Burkina Faso people. Just 1 week after the attempted overthrow of President Traoré, Burkina Faso's Prime Minister, Rimal Bajen Emmanuel Urago, welcomed Denmark's special representative for the Great Lakes and Sahel, Nogard Marasen, alongside Christian Kierkegaard, Adinga, Denmark's sitting ambassador. They met to discuss what can only be described as a quiet diplomatic reset, one that confirms Denmark's intention to stay present in the Sahel. After the meeting, Markussen made Denmark's position unmistakably clear. Denmark respects the sovereign decisions of each country. We are a small country that also makes sovereign decisions. It was a rare moment of diplomatic humility, a sharp contrast to the usual tone Western nations take with African leadership. She praised the nearly 40-year-long relationship between the two countries, grounded in mutual cooperation on issues like agriculture and access to clean water. But beneath the necessities lies a deep truth. Denmark, like much of Europe, is recalibrating. The West knows it cannot afford to lose influence in a continent that is no longer passive. Burkina Faso under Traoré is asserting its sovereignty, and the world is beginning to adjust quietly, cautiously but unmistakably. Isn't it remarkable how Denmark has shifted its stance, how it has come to recognize Burkina Faso, not as a project, but as a sovereign equal, For a long time, Western nations viewed African governments as subordinate, unstable, or in need of supervision, but under President Ibrahim Traoré, that narrative has been forcefully rejected. Denmark has learned what others are just beginning to grasp. Traoré is not a puppet, his administration has made it clear. Burkina Faso sovereignty is not up for negotiation, and now Denmark isn't just backing down, it's showing respect. This isn't just about diplomacy, it's about power dynamics. Traoré didn't beg for respect, he commanded it, and that's the lesson the rest of Africa must absorb. The West has never truly treated African leaders as equals, only as recipients of aid, partners on paper, and sometimes pawns in global power games. But that imbalance has endured largely because too many African leaders have accepted it out of weakness, out of greed. Look no further than Kenya's President William Ruto, eagerly volunteering troops to serve America's interests. In Haiti, responding like a child desperate for validation from a distant parent. It's not just shameful, it's dangerous because true sovereignty begins with the courage to say no. Traoré said no, and now even Denmark is listening, but President Ibrahim Traoré is not like the others. He has made one thing abundantly clear. He will only be treated as an equal, and anyone who refuses, they will be ignored. This is the essence of strong leadership, not chasing validation from global powers, but standing firm on principle. Traoré has shown the world that sovereignty is not something to be begged for, it's something to be enforced. This firm stance hasn't just reshaped Burkina Faso's relationship with Denmark, it has forced other Western powers to rethink their approach, Germany included. When Traoré rose to power, Germany was among the first to condemn him. It followed France's lead, suspending diplomatic ties and declaring that relations would only resume if Traoré transitioned to civilian rule. But once again, the West miscalculated their pressure. Campaign fell flat. Burkina Faso did not bend Germany's Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Venya Schulz, arrived in Ouagadougou not to lecture but to reconcile. She announced Germany's readiness to resume diplomatic ties. Yes, she reaffirmed Germany's preference for democratic systems. But in a moment of striking honesty, she admitted something rare. Most people in the world live under non-democratic government, and Germany has no choice but to deal with that reality. In other words, Traoré didn't change. Germany did, according to Germany's minister. There is no longer a black and white approach to diplomacy, only shades of strategic necessity. She openly admitted that if Germany pulled out of the Sahel, others would fill the vacuum, and others in this case clearly meant Russia. She didn't mince words. Germany could not afford to abandon the region and leave it to Russian influence. Her message was wrapped in diplomacy, but the subtext was clear. Berlin is worried. What once sounded like moral high ground now sounds like desperation, because here's the truth. Africa doesn't need Europe, but Europe desperately needs Africa. The resources, the markets, the geostrategic position Africa holds, the cards, and now Traoré is playing his hand without fear. Meanwhile, as the West scrambles to recalibrate, Cuba stands firm, unmoved, unwavering. Unlike Denmark or Germany, Cuba never turned its back on Burkina Faso. The relationship between the two nations is rooted in decades of revolutionary solidarity. So when the coup failed and President Traoré stood tall, Cuba didn't hesitate. Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez flew to Ouagadougou to meet directly with Traoré. Rodriguez later posted on social media that their discussion focused on Cuba's 2024 accomplishments and shared challenges ahead, but beneath the formal language was something deeper. Mutual respect between two nations that have never needed Western approval to stand together. A high level of commitment to the homeland was expressed, declared Cuba's foreign minister. His words echoing far beyond protocol during his meeting with President Traoré. He didn't just speak of current affairs. He invoked history. He recalled the legendary bond between Thomas Sankara and the Cuban revolutionaries, Fidel and Raul Castro. It was a reminder that this wasn't a new alliance, it was a torch being passed down. At the Sankara Memorial, he met with solidarity activists and the Cuba-Burkina Faso fraternity organizations, honoring a shared revolutionary past that still fuels present-day diplomacy. In a meeting with his Burkina Faso counterpart, Jean-Marie Traoré He reaffirmed Cuba's commitment to strengthening ties, especially with 2025 marking 50 years of uninterrupted diplomatic relations between the two nations. But this isn't just about symbolism, it's about actions. A few months before the visit, a historic deal was signed, one that marked a new chapter in cooperation. On September 4, 2024, Burkina Faso's ministerial representative for regional cooperation, Stella Arden Carbo, hosted Cuban ambassador Nadezhka Navarro in Ouagadougou. Together, they discussed expanding collaboration into new territories within Burkina Faso. The ambassador came not just as a diplomat, but as a partner, accompanied by a representative from the Luxembourg Agency for Development and Works, marking the birth of a tripartite initiative. Cuba made it clear it doesn't just support Burkina Faso. Politically, it wants to build with it in a world where many nations wait to see which way the wind blows. Cuba and Burkina Faso are proving that some alliances are built to last. The ambassador further stated that these regions will be decided and identified by all the parties involved, but that she will ensure that they are a priority for Burkina Faso. In her own words, she said, "We can develop projects on a tripartite basis, that is, Cuba will bring the expertise and Luxembourg will take care of the financial resources." In her response, the Burkina Faso representative praised the good relations between Burkina Faso and Cuba, as well as the upcoming investment of Cuba and Luxembourg. She further stated that Cuba needs to work with the different ministries of Burkina Faso to identify projects that will benefit the Burkina Faso people, while this was the first time Burkina Faso and Cuba have signed an agreement. The relations between Burkina Faso and Cuba did not start recently. In fact, Burkina Faso and Cuba have had very good diplomatic relations for over 40 years. This relationship has existed since 1975 and is beneficial for both countries. No wonder that last year, the two countries celebrated the 48th anniversary of the establishment of bilateral relations. Over the last few years, Burkina Faso has contributed to the training of doctors in Burkina Faso, and Burkina Faso have supported Cuba's request at the United Nations to lift the economic trade and financial blockade imposed by the United States on the island nation, which has lasted for more than 60 years. Cuba and Burkina Faso may be worlds apart on the map, but they share a common bond, a relentless struggle against Western domination. Like Burkina Faso, Cuba has stood its ground, refusing to bow to imperial pressure. But Cuba's battle has been far longer and far more punishing. For over 60 years, the island nation has endured one of the harshest economic sanctions. Regimes in modern history imposed not by the global community but by a single country, the United States, since February 3, 1962. This blockade has choked Cuba's economy, raised the cost of, triggered widespread shortages, and drained the nation of over $144 billion in losses. Education, trade, healthcare, and industry all devastated. And despite 31 United Nations resolutions calling for the sanctions to end, Washington has refused to budge, but it goes further. Not only has the US tightened the blockade, it's layered on new sanctions and, without presenting a shred of evidence, labeled Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism. These moves weren't about justice or facts, they were about power. The kind of power that operates outside the law, immune to global condemnation, because the truth is, countries like the US act not because they must, but because they can. The international outcry means nothing. And that's the lesson Cuba, Burkina Faso, and others have come to learn firsthand in a world where the rules are written by empires, sovereignty isn't granted, it's taken, defended, and paid for in full. The United States claims its sanctions on Cuba are about human rights violations, communism, and regional instability. But let's be honest, this is about punishment. Decades ago, Cuba made a choice. It stood with the Soviet Union, and for that, the US has never forgiven it. The blockade isn't about democracy, it's about dominance. It's about sending a message to any small nation that dares to defy the global order. But Cuba, like Burkina Faso, has refused to bow. What binds these two nations isn't just shared hardship, it's shared conviction. A belief in sovereignty, in self-determination, in the right to stand free no matter the cost. And Cuba has proven this loyalty time and again, particularly in Africa during the Cold War. It wasn't the West but Cuba that stood beside African liberation movements, offering not just soldiers but doctors, teachers and engineers. So when Cuba now invests in Burkina Faso, it's not a pivot, it's a continuation of a legacy. Only the tools have changed. Where once there were weapons, today there is biotechnology. Where once there were soldiers, today there are scientists and doctors, while Western nations often reduce partnership to profit margins and influence. Cuba offers something deeper. Solidarity rooted in struggle despite its own economic limitations. Cuba brings to Burkina Faso what it does best: its renowned healthcare system, advancements in biotech, and innovative renewable energy technologies. It's a different kind of aid, not one designed to trap but to uplift, and in doing so, Cuba is helping Burkina Faso build the kind of future Western powers never truly offered, one defined not by dependency but by dignity. And indeed, Cuba has become more than just an ally. It has become an example, an inspiration, a living testimony to the idea that a nation can resist, survive, and even thrive outside the grip of Western aid and control. Its growing partnership with Burkina Faso is proof that cooperation doesn't have to come with strings attached. This is not a typical transactional deal rooted in exploitation. It's mutual, it's strategic, it's revolutionary. For Cuba investing in Burkina Faso, it strengthens its diplomatic footprint across Africa, particularly among the nations that share a legacy of anti-colonial struggle and resistance to Western dominance. And for a country battered by decades of sanctions, this is also about economic survival. By collaborating in sectors like healthcare, biotech, and renewable energy, Cuba isn't just helping others, it's diversifying its own economy and carving out new pathways for growth beyond US-dominated systems. But if you ask whether Cuba's investment in Burkina Faso is surprising, the answer is simple: not at all. The bond between these two nations runs deep, woven through the spirit of one man who shaped the very soul of modern Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara. When Sankara came to power, he didn't just admire Fidel Castro and Chavera, he emulated them. He saw in Cuba a blueprint for revolutionary governance. He established committees for the defense of the revolution, directly inspired by Castro's grassroots model of revolutionary vigilance. Sankara viewed Cuba not as a distant ally but as a brother in arms in the global fight for dignity, justice, and sovereignty. And today, as President Traoré walks a similar path, that legacy lives on not in speeches but in actions. It's no wonder they called him the African Che Guevara. Like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara was a revolutionary, beloved by the masses, feared by the establishment, and hated by the Western powers. He wasn't just charismatic, he was defiant. French President François Mitterrand once described him as a difficult character after a tense exchange, but that was an understatement. Sankara was a threat not because of violence, but because of ideas, dangerous ideas. Ideas that Africa could stand on its own, that Burkina Faso would no longer take orders from Paris, Washington, or any other Western capital. He openly declared that his country would choose its own allies, including so-called enemies of the West like Cuba, North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union. The growing support from nations like Denmark and Cuba for President Ibrahim Traoré reveals something deeper, something that African history has really allowed us to witness. That African leaders can command global respect, that they can inspire love, not just from their people, but from the world. But that respect is never given freely, it must be earned, not through submission, but through service, not by begging for aid, but by standing for the people. For too long, the African continent has been led by men who sold their nation's futures for briefcases of Western money and promises of political power, and the West, they have learned the pattern. Apply pressure, offer rewards, watch the leaders fold. But Traoré broke the pattern. His strength, his clarity, his refusal to compromise has forced even Western powers to shift their tone. No wonder US military officials have described him and the AES leadership as sophisticated, because they know they are not dealing with puppets, they are facing sovereign men. This is the lesson, and it must echo across every capital of the continent. Sovereignty is not requested, it's asserted. Traoré didn't ask for permission to lead his people. He earned their loyalty, and through that loyalty, he gained the power that no foreign influence could ever grant. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comment section below, and don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.